Hello everyone, welcome to another reaction video. My name's Dave, and in today's video, I'm going to be doing a reaction to a reaction. Okay, so Matt Beat, Mr. Beat, did a video years ago about the partisan switch in the South, I believe. It's called the Big Switch or the Party Switch or whatever. So he did a video, and then Chris from Vlogging Through History did reaction to that video. And I want to do a reaction basically to both of their videos. And the reason why is right now I'm working on a video series that'll probably be about 2.5 hours long, looking at the specific thing. And the problem I notice when people look at this party switch, big switch, whatever, say only do it within the context of history and glean what they can from history. Nobody uses political science. Nobody uses the ANES study, for example, that's the American National Election Studies, to then figure out what happened. So the video I'm looking to do, or I am doing right now, is to look at election history at the congressional, U.S. Senate, and gubernatorial level, because one of the biggest problems with these analyses is they just look at the electoral maps from a few years and say, yeah, that explains everything. No, it does not. So we're going to go through these videos, see the reactions, and see what's said. Now, I will say I'm impressed with Matt. Now, I know Matt, salt of the earth guy, great guy. So I've responded to one of his on my political channel, but I don't know Chris personally. He did a reaction to one of my videos not that long ago. I kind of reacted back a little bit. I didn't intend to, but it was like the next video I did, and he just gave me a little bit of ammunition to put in there. So I did put that in there about the 6 political myths. So I don't know. I don't know Chris at all. But one thing I want to say when looking at this thumbnail about the video here is that this is obviously Chris watching the video. The person to the left is Bruce Alger. Now, Bruce Alger was elected in 1952 or 1954, I believe, one of those. He was one of the first Republican congressmen to win, to be outside of the Appalachia area. Okay, he was pretty much the first, along with him and Bill Kramer in Florida, that really started capturing suburban votes, middle class, upper middle class votes. Now, the stronghold for the Republicans back in the late 1940s, early 1950s was Appalachia. That comes from the history of the Appalachian region supporting the Union, and politically that went to the Republicans. As a matter of fact, the first congressional district of Tennessee has been represented by a Republican for the last 161 years, with the exception of like 4 years. Right, so it's a strong Republican area, and it mostly has to do with support for the Union. So Appalachia, which was very self-reliant, said, hey, we're not going to fight for slaveholders and their slave plantations down on the plains while we're, doing what we are here. We don't want to fight for their cause. So this is where it comes from. So let's go ahead and take a look at this video. Let's go ahead and watch this video. Oh, and by the way, before we get into this video, please subscribe to the channel. And this is a 51-minute video, so we might have a long reaction to this video. So let's go ahead and check it out.
If there's a topic that people love to debate when it comes to history and modern politics, it's the party switch. It's something we hear about all the time, but what does it really mean? And did it really even happen? That's what we're going to tackle today. A lot of you have been requesting that I do this reaction, or that I at least talk about this topic. And if you've been around for very long, you know that I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Beat, Matt Beat, who I've gotten to know and have done a live stream with. We did a 4-hour live stream together, talking about where we would rank the U.S. presidents. It was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll have him on this channel sometime to do something again. So I've got a ton of respect for Matt. I know he knows what he's talking about. He puts the time in to do it right. Even if he and I don't always agree on things, I certainly respect him. And that's all I can ask for with anybody. Listen, I don't expect anybody to see things the way that I see them. So long as we can be respectful, we can be educated, and know what we're talking about, there's plenty of room for healthy debate. So I'm interested to see what he has to say in this video. It's why did the American political party switch?
I'm that Mr. Beat guy. I mean, it's true. Anyway, here is an electoral vote map for the presidential election of 2020 and the presidential election of 2016 and 2012. And one thing that probably stands out about these maps is how much the American South tends to support the Republican candidate.
And see, this to me, just right off the bat, this to me, and I don't blame Matt for that, I think it's just how it is. This to me is the flaw of the argument. And I mentioned this in the intro of this video, which is that it focuses on the Electoral College instead of going deeper. But I think Matt will go deeper. Again, I have not seen his video, but I do believe if we're going to be talking about this party switch, it needs to be taken outside of the context of the Electoral College.
You keep going back, and in election after election after election, the majority of folks in the South are voting for the Republican candidate. Well, hold up. That's a little different there. The Democrat Clinton did fairly well in the South in 1996.
Who was a Democrat, who was a Southerner. He's the governor of Arkansas, and his running mate was a senator from Tennessee.
Right.
So they were both Southerners.
Oh, and even better in 1992. Well, but he was from the South, so of course he'd do better in the South. Let's go back further. See, now the South is all in for the Republican Bush Sr., and pretty much all of the country is for the Republican Reagan in '84. Going back further, dang, Reagan. Okay, keep going back. Okay, what?
And with Carter, of course, another Southern Democrat who's from Georgia.
What the heck now? The South is...
And remember, he almost swept the South. He only lost Virginia by like 1.2 or 1.3%. He could have swept the South in this election.
Practically all in for the Democrat Carter? I'm getting confused here. Keep going back. Nixon, you snake, you. Okay, go back further. Oh, interesting. That's right. George Wallace, who spent most of his life associated with the Democratic Party, is now dominating the South with his pro-racial segregation platform. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And the Deep South is all for the Republican Goldwater.
Now, I do want to mention something here that's really important. I'm going to mention my video that I have that's coming out on the other channel. First of all, if we're looking at the former Confederate states, Johnson won more of the states than Goldwater. Goldwater won these 5, whereas Johnson won 6. North Carolina, Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas. In each one of those states that Johnson won, he increased his vote percentage over what John F. Kennedy did. In the state of Alabama, he was not on the ballot. He performed poorly, in Georgia and South Carolina. In Mississippi, he was like down from Kennedy by 23%. And then you have Louisiana here, and Johnson was down on Kennedy by 7%. I think that needs a little bit more actual study, because Louisiana went for, I believe it went for Dwight Eisenhower in both elections. It might not have, but I think it might have been at least in 56. And the reason why I say we got to examine that is mostly because of the fact that Kennedy was a Catholic. So did he overperform in Louisiana because of that? So I think that this election, and when we look at that map, it's taken a little bit more out of context. Again, Johnson increased his percentage over Kennedy in every one of those states that he won.
While most of the rest of the country is for the Democrat Lyndon Johnson in 1964? Interesting. And in 1960, all those Southern votes going to the Democrat Harry Byrd, who was infamously pro-racial segregation.
Oh, yeah.
But of course, there also you have Kennedy running with a running mate, Lyndon Johnson, who's a Southern Democrat. This is really more a matter of conservative versus liberal than it is Democrat versus Republican.
Yes, and see, and it'll be interesting to see what Chris says here. That is absolutely correct. A lot of the people who want to say that something did or didn't happen, especially when it comes to the conservative side of things, they want to conflate political party and ideology. Okay, this is why when you see D'Souza or Shapiro talk about how all this stuff's a myth, they always say Democrat, Democrat, Democrat. They never say conservative, conservative, because it blows their argument. So good job, Chris.
The South, all throughout history, going all the way back, has tended to be more conservative. The North tends to be more liberal. And so then it varies from candidate to candidate and from party system to party system.
Yep.
Harry Byrd, who was infamously pro-racial segregation, and in the 1950s, the majority of folks in the South are voting for the Democratic candidate. So what is going on here?
Matt's videos, his older videos, will get you copyright struck because of the music he uses, unfortunately.
Illustrates the biggest and most famous political party switch in American history. In fact, it's sometimes just called the party switch. You see, from the 1950s all the way up to the late 1990s, while the politics of most Southerners stayed the same, the political party which most Southerners belonged to did not. In the 1950s, most Southerners leaned to the right politically, aka they were conservatives. In the 1990s, most Southerners still leaned to the right politically, aka they were conservatives. But in the 1950s, most of these conservative Southerners were Democrats, and by the late 1990s, most of these conservative Southerners were Republicans. And African Americans, who had traditionally voted for the Republican Party since, you know, that was the party that had historically fought more for their rights, began to vote for Democrats. In fact, in the election of 1936, FDR got 71%.
I am so glad that Matt actually brings this up, because I think so many people think that the African-American vote switched over in 1960 after John F. Kennedy intervened to get Martin Luther King out of jail, or 1964, the Civil Rights Act, right? So I think that a lot of people think that's when it happened. No, it happened much earlier than that. It did dip a little bit under Eisenhower, but not much. So good on Matt for bringing this historically to black voters being strong Democratic voters in 1936, definitely, and just pretty much flatlined from that point on.
Of the African American vote.
And this is important to note because, as we've been saying, there's no black and white switch, like, and I don't mean black and white as far as race goes. I mean just in terms of black and white. It's more of a gray area. There's no, like, you can say, well, the parties switched. No, they evolved. And policies changed, and they're constantly, there's no one switch. There's multiple times where they shift polarizations, and it's going to continue to happen. And 20 years from now, the Democrats and Republicans won't look anything like they look today, and 20 years after that, it'll look very different again. And so we're going to see these back and forth switches as far as how people vote.
Now, this may seem a bit puzzling, as a big chunk of the Democratic Party had been the party of racist Jim Crow laws and literally supported the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, you know, even into the 1960s, you've got the Democrats voting en masse, the Southern Democrats voting en masse against civil rights. But back in the 30s, 71% of African Americans vote for the Democrat. That's because it's much more nuanced and much more complicated than just a straight geographic or a straight party thing.
Yep, 100%.
And why the heck would African Americans go to the party that not only allowed racist policies, but even embraced racist policies, especially in the South. Well, to put it simply, they liked FDR and hated Hoover, despite FDR avoiding even bringing up civil rights issues most of the time.
So, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
to them, the Democratic Party was the party of FDR. It wasn't the party of George Wallace. Wallace wasn't really on the scene yet, but you know what I mean. They're not looking at the local level at the racist, segregationist people in the South who are
Right.
Democrats. They're looking at FDR as the figure of the Democratic Party. He's a northern Democrat from New York, and he's very, very different than the ones in the South.
Well, and another thing to remember is, at this time, an overwhelming majority of blacks could not vote in the South. So they couldn't even participate in these elections. And if you go back, let's see, if we go back to this map that Matt shows, I don't know if it's in this situation, but it might be. So there were the opportunities to have at-large districts. And one of the reasons that eventually in the 60s, a lot of political parties, local political parties, changed their structure was to reduce black influence in a political party. So, for example, in Barber County, Alabama, after the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, once African Americans were able to vote in Alabama, you had Barber County, and they found out that with the Democratic Party split up into different districts in the county, and by the way, this is the county that George Wallace came from. With the Democratic Party, it was split into different districts. It was a majority white county, but in 3 or 4 districts, blacks made up the majority. So what happened was that the Barber County Democratic Party went ahead and made the districts that you had to be from those districts maybe, but it was going to be an at-large vote. So if you had, let's say, 10 districts in the county and 3 of them were heavily African American, you're going to have 3 people who are African American involved with the executive of the Democratic Party in Barber County. But if you make them all at-large districts, then you kick out those 3 and you still keep the white supremacist mood within the party. So I don't know if that is the case in these, but it very much was the case after the Civil Rights Act, because once those people were able to vote, then there was still, I mean, even though we think of the Civil Rights Act of 65 as opening up the floodgates, no, there were still problems. Blacks were still intimidated. Okay, they weren't pushed away, they were intimidated. Local registration officials screwed around with party registration. So, for example, they would register, an African American would go in and register as a Democrat. Then the clerk would register him as a Republican. They'd go in to vote and they'd say, "Oh no, you're a registered Republican. You can't vote in this Democratic primary." So there are a lot of shenanigans going on, and this all came out. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights did a report in 1968 that I will be putting in my next video. I'll be putting it in the links and so you can see it and read it. You can Google search it now, and it talks about all the hurdles that blacks were still had to go through, like a bunch of the hurdles they had to jump over. Another one would be that if they wanted to get involved with party politics, the white office holders of the party would basically keep the meeting time, date, and place secret so that blacks could not be involved. So there are a whole bunch of shenanigans going on when we're looking at that election.
than Hoover. And at least FDR gave lip service to issues African Americans cared about. He spoke out against lynching and poll taxes, for example. His New Deal programs sounded a lot like the Square Deal reforms of a previous president African Americans mostly supported, the distant cousin of FDR, a Republican by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. Plus, by the 1930s, African Americans associated the Democratic Party as the party committed to organized labor, which they did actually benefit from in northern cities. Flash forward to 1948, and the Democratic Party all of a sudden was a lot less racist than it used to be. They added civil rights for African Americans to their platform. Quote,
and Harry Truman is the one who desegregates the military. And so for the first time, you have black and white enlisted men being able to serve in the same units, for example.
The Democratic Party is responsible for the great civil rights gains made in recent years in eliminating unfair and illegal discrimination based on race, creed, or color. Not only,
which is absolutely true, while at the same time, Southern Democrats were actively opposing those. So again, it's complicated. It's all very, very complicated.
That, but Democrat President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military. All of this made a lot of Southern Democrats mad, and they literally left the party, starting a new political party called the States' Rights Democratic Party. Members of this party became known as Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats wanted to keep the policy of racial segregation in the South and allow states to keep their infamous Jim Crow laws. And then,
and this idea of states' rights is the same thing that Thomas Jefferson was in favor of. He was much more in favor of strong state governments and a weaker central government. It's one of the basis. It's kind of the basis for the Democrats of the 1860s and secession. And even before that, you had the nullification crisis where states were trying to nullify federal laws. And so for a long time, the Southern conservatives were in favor of states' rights. And you do see that today in the Republican Party, especially in the South. There's a strong view towards states' rights and opposing the federal government. So in that sense, there definitely has been a switch. The party of states' rights has definitely switched from being the Democrats to being the Republicans.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
In 1950,
and then again, even though we don't think of it as necessarily left-right, it is. I mean, that's an ideological difference. And that's what you're going to see at the end of the day, is a lot of this has to do with ideological differences. They don't have to do with necessarily partisan differences. Remember, at the end of the day, a partisan label is simply that. It's a label. It's a club. It's a collection of people who usually have a common goal. But by this time, and it'll be interesting to see what Matt says from now until, let's be honest, the 1990, 1992, 1994, especially 94 with the contract with America, both political parties still have liberals, conservatives, and moderates within their party. So that shows that that combination really mattered. I mean, by the time we get to the 1978 election in Congress, and we already think, when we think of the big switch, we think of it happening in 62, 64, 68, 70, 72, right? Thinking of Nixon's big landslide election, which, by the way, the South wasn't an outlier. The whole country won for him, except for Massachusetts. Anyway, that being the case, the one thing that's important to remember is that in 1978, when Jimmy Carter was president, the Republicans in the South only had about 27% of the seats in the House of Representatives. They weren't near the majority yet. That didn't happen until during Reagan. And then 94 was a huge year for the Republicans. That's probably your most significant year when we talk about this change in party influence in the South.
But yeah, it said racial segregation was unconstitutional, and this was when what we know of today as the civil rights movement totally went mainstream.
Yep.
It was a turning point. And while most Republicans supported the decision, most Southern Democrats did not. And now it's time to talk about something that is often misunderstood, and some say is not even real. And that, my friends, is the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy was a real Republican Party electoral strategy.
Okay, so I guess he's not going to talk about Bruce Alger specifically, but I don't go into the Southern Strategy when I talk about my videos because do I believe that it existed? Yes, not to necessarily the extent. It maybe had more of an impact on presidential races. It didn't necessarily have as much of an impact on gubernatorial, U.S. Senate, or races for Congress, or definitely not races for the legislature. The Democrats, I mean, that's kind of the last vestige for a lot of the Democrats, was the state legislatures. A lot of them hadn't changed until within the past 20 years. So the Southern Strategy, I don't want to say that it was a specific strategy necessarily, as much as it was part of an overall just vibe and where things were going. Because you got to realize that even at this time, if we're looking at the 1950s, okay, now it says LBJ sold out to Yank, so this would have been in the early 60s. This would have been. At this point, we still don't see, we see Republicans making some inroads. They'll get some gains in 64. They'll lose a lot of those gains. But then this goes back to something, I don't know if Matt's going to talk about it, but nobody talks about it when talking about the party switch. And that is that there were a huge amount of Northern Republicans moving into states like North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and a lot of them had their Republican alliances that they brought with them. And this is the problem I have when talking about the party switch, is a lot of people treat the southern region as a monolithic region that just has no, it's not fluid. And the fact that the people who talk about this always forget to talk about the people who migrated from the north down to the south, that to me is a huge, huge gap when it comes to researching this.
To increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to the existing racism there against African Americans. Most historians point to its origin to what's known today as the Southern Manifesto, a document written in 1956 in response to Brown versus the Board of Education that called for an opposition to racial integration of public places, but mostly just calling for states' rights, bro. States' rights.
So here's why you see such strong arguments over the idea of the party switch and the Southern Strategy in general. Yes, the Southern Strategy, absolutely a real thing. The problem is that, as best I can see it, and remember, all of this is coming from my bias as a white Christian conservative, okay? So I'm laying that out there, okay? I am acknowledging that. And so folks who see the world differently than I do are going to see this issue differently, and that's okay. But here's how I have seen and how I've experienced this debate in my time and talking to people with it. On the Christian, conservative, Southern, whatever you want to call it, Republican side of things. And for the record, I am not a Republican, okay? I'm not registered with either party, so don't go labeling me that way. I am conservative. The issue here is that On the Republican side, you have people trying to argue that the Southern, and not all people, because I don't deny it, that the Southern strategy was not a real thing. And you have on the liberal side people saying Southern strategy proves that Republicans
Yeah.
are racist today.
Right.
They're both wrong.
Right.
It's a knee-jerk reaction to each other. You know, when you have people on the more liberal side saying the Southern strategy means that because in the 60s there was a Southern strategy to reach out and appeal to the segregationists and racists.
But see, okay, so this is okay. I'm gonna stop this right here, and this is why I say I don't necessarily believe, and I'm the opposite of Chris. I'm an independent. I'm a Bernie Sanders independent, very much on the left, and on the left when it comes to issues of race, very much to the hard left when it comes to issues of religion. I'm an atheist, so I am the total opposite of him. This is why I say you can't say the Southern Manifesto is part of the Southern strategy, because it was mostly Democrats that created the Southern Manifesto, right? It was the Democrats that actually went ahead and created it. And Bruce Alger, the person, as a matter of fact, Bruce Alger, the person that he just showed here, right, in the Bruce Alger, he voted against, or not voted against, he did not sign the Southern Manifesto. He did not sign it. He was not one of the signers. As a matter of fact, an overwhelming majority of people in the Texas delegation did not sign it because they saw it as politically stupid. Okay, basically, Lyndon Johnson told everyone, hey, if you sign this, you're going to look like an idiot all over. And many didn't sign it. I think out of all the members of Congress that Texas had, only 6 of them signed it. So this is where I think kind of the story breaks apart. How can the Republicans be creating the Southern strategy using the Southern Manifesto when it was the Democrats that actually created the Southern Manifesto? That's where I'm like, that just does not make sense. That just does not equal to one another. This is one of the reasons why I don't think the Southern strategy is necessarily a real thing. Now, I think Chris is onto something, that things just fluidly fall into place. But with the exception of, let's say, Lee Atwater, I would say, and even with Lee Atwater, I wouldn't even say that was a Southern strategy. I would say by the time Lee Atwater came in to help Bush, by that time, the issue of race was national. Because you got to realize, after segregation, after the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 68, and the Voting Rights Act of 65, the issues shifted. George Wallace is a perfect example. 68, he's talking about segregation, right? That's all of a sudden non-issue. Now he switches over to busing, because that becomes a new issue. So this is why I don't think the Southern strategy existed. Because again, Southern Manifesto was not created by the Republicans. It was created by the Democrats. So that's, to me, kind of an important thing.
60s, there was a Southern strategy to reach out and appeal to the segregationists and racist South. Means that all people who are Republican conservatives in the South today are also racist. No, you can't make that connection like that. And so,
and he's right, you can't. Another thing to remember, in 1960, 1964, with the exception of 5 congressional districts. Okay, so you had a gain of 5 congressional districts in Alabama, 1 in Mississippi, and 1 in Georgia. Out of those 7 that were gained, the 1 in Mississippi, that guy was like a pure racist. Like, he was going to white citizens councils meetings and all that. Congressman Walker was doing that. But he would end up losing because he ran statewide. So his seat went over to Sonny Montgomery, who one could maybe argue is just as racist, a Democrat. The seat in Georgia was lost, and 2 of the seats in Alabama were lost. But at this time, the Republicans weren't really targeting, I would argue, based on the election results and based on what we've seen, the Republicans were not necessarily targeting the racist Republicans. The Republicans were doing really well for years, primarily in two areas. One, the Appalachian area or the high mountain areas like the Ozarks, where the Republicans had done well previously, or in the newly growing suburban areas of places like St. Petersburg, Dallas, Georgia. That one that I just mentioned in Georgia was a district that hit suburban Atlanta. Newt Gingrich. I mean, if we want to keep on going down to 1978, Newt Gingrich was elected out of suburban Georgia because the suburbs were becoming really Republican. So if you look at the voting patterns and you look at where the wins are, the places where the Republicans were winning at first, especially during this time, was not where the big racists were. Okay? It wasn't there at all. And this goes back to another thing. And let's see, I got the book right here, actually. Fiorina's book about retrospective voting. Now, this is where I think it really comes in. To me, and even Congressman Dickinson, who won in 1964, William Dickinson from Alabama, he was either in the first or second congressional district down in Mobile. He even said it's not as much that people are going to vote for Johnson or for Goldwater as much as they're going to vote against Johnson because nobody wants anything to do with this administration. That was a quote that he said. And that's what I think we see here. I think that instead of people and voters going to the Republicans, and this is what retrospective voting and all that, they look at what happened in the past and then reward punishment. You either reward somebody for doing a good job or punish them for doing the bad job. And if you punish them, it's the other side that's going to get the reward. That's what I think happened in the South at this time, that the Democrats were getting punished for many of these issues. Now, were they getting punished because of the racial issue? That's probably the case. Okay. But I've never been a person who believed that the Republicans were targeting the racist South because, again, where the results come from, suburban areas like Pinellas County, Florida, though it had its problems way in the past. By the time that Bill Kramer was elected in Pinellas County, Florida, it was just a bunch of Northerners, retirees, and all that came from the North who were conservative, but not necessarily on the race issue. They moved to Florida because of lower taxes, sunshine, stuff like that. But they were still Republicans nonetheless. A lot of people were in the military as well. And a lot of those people were Republicans because of Eisenhower being president. So yeah, I'm pretty much on the side that I say the Southern strategy, to me, the evidence is not there. And again, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. I voted for him 3 times. I'm very not part of the Southern ideas, right? So yeah.
What happens then is that you have people, conservatives who are Republicans, who are not racist, who hear that accusation and they respond to it by saying, well, the Southern strategy, that's just not real at all. The party switch, well, that never happened. Both are wrong.
Well, okay, now this is, okay. Now what he says here is right. Now, when I said I don't think the Southern strategy really exists, I just gave you a list of reasons why. Retrospective voting or, punish voting, where the votes were coming from, Appalachia and the growing suburban area, which were getting more Northerners as well, or just people with more money. Okay. So I'm not coming from it from a point of, oh, I don't believe in it because it doesn't go at my narrative. Going into my research when looking at this, I didn't know. But as the research started happening more and more, I'm like, if there really were, if it really was race, especially 1964, 66, so on, 68, then we would have seen them win, the Republicans win, in the places that were mostly along the Black Belt. Because the places that were in V.L. Key, in his book about Southern politics, I don't have it with me, I have it in my backpack. But V.L. Key's book about Southern politics basically said the most racist areas, the most Democratic areas were in the Black Belt because they had to keep black voters down, or black citizens down, to not vote. They didn't want them to vote because they knew if blacks were allowed to be able to vote, the game was up for them, right? So again, this is where I say, I'm saying I don't see the Southern strategy as a thing that happened based on the evidence of what I have seen. Now, when we look at the ANES studies in 1964, we do see that if someone has a more favorable opinion of whites, they're more likely to vote for Goldwater. If they have more favorable opinions of blacks, they're more likely going to vote for Johnson in southern states, not nationwide, in southern states. So there is a racial aspect to it, but I think it's more of a reward punishment, retrospective voting part of it, instead of some concerted effort to target these people.
Both ignore the nuances, and both are attempts to demonize the other side. You can be conservative and Southern and not be racist.
Correct.
Okay? Please understand that. You can,
and I hate to stop it again, but that's a very interesting thing, because communism, being anti-communist, or being pro-communist, excuse me, or whatever, communism was used as a dog whistle for integration, opposition to segregation, even opposing white supremacy. So you would hear a lot of people say that, oh, they're a communist, whatever. They did this with Martin Luther King a lot, right? And basically, communist and socialist was a dog whistle for racism, okay? But then you have people like Claude Pepper from Florida, who is extremely anti-communist, but very much in favor of civil rights. In fact, it lost him his Senate seat. Why? Because George Smathers called him a communist. Why did he call him a communist? Well, I think you know why. So, yeah, the nuance with this is so much, because like for every Lester Maddox I can show you, you know, I can show you a Claude Pepper. I can show you a Robert King High or something like, I can show you somebody else that counterbalances that weight. So Chris is right here that it's nuanced. And I know that he says it's nuanced. But I'm glad he says that, even though I don't know if he knows as much about the intricacies of Southern politics at this time. The fact that he's not making it something definitive, I respect.
also be conservative and Southern and be racist. It does happen both ways. But I think that's where a lot of the argument and where a lot of the problem comes in with all of this, is that people try to apply what happened in the 60s to people today, or what happened in the 1860s. You know, same thing's true. A Southern Democrat in the 1860s was pro-slavery, which means that the Democrats are the party of racism and slavery. Also not true. Okay?
That's what PragerU argues.
Just because you are something now doesn't mean you are what that thing was back
That's
then.
what PragerU argues.
Saying the federal government should stop trying to overturn state laws. 19 U.S. senators and 82 representatives.
There you go, right there. See? Look at all them Texans who voted against it. Bruce Alger, can't see it, but right here. Bill Kramer, where in Florida, he actually did sign it. So yeah, but some others did not sign it as well. But yeah, Texas was a big one. Tennessee as well. Howard Baker did not sign. That's Howard Baker Sr. And most of these who did not sign it, only a few, and I think 2 from North Carolina, were the only ones that didn't sign it, that they suffered the consequences. So there was one member here from, I believe, North Carolina. He said, hey, I don't have to live in Washington my whole life. And his name was Dean, Congressman Dean. I don't remember his first name, but maybe that's it. Charles Dean right there. Charles Dean basically said, hey, listen, I can leave Washington, D.C., okay, but I have to live with myself, with my vote, and I'm never going to write down and sign anything that would make somebody a second-class citizen. He ended up losing his primary. But for those who did not sign the Southern Manifesto, again, created by the Democrats, okay, there really was no consequence to it. And this is why I think if you're making this the focal point of your argument regarding the Southern Manifesto being the genesis of the Southern strategy, well, then it's the Democrats creating the Southern strategy then, not the Republicans.
From the South, almost all of them Democrats,
Right.
signed it. One dude who
Right.
didn't sign it was Texas U.S. Representative Bruce Alger,
there
who
we
was
go.
a Republican. However, perhaps he could see which way the tide was going, and he campaigned for the midterm elections in 1956 as a pro-segregationist, which
Yes.
got him easily reelected. Other Southern Democrats took notice of his victory over the next few years.
And this goes back to what I said, and yeah, Bruce Alger was part of the Texas delegation, and basically Lyndon Johnson and maybe Sam Rayburn. Sam Rayburn was the speaker at that time, but I think it was mostly Lyndon Johnson saying, "No, don't vote for this. It's stupid." Okay, and that was their approach. Now there is another thing. Speaking of Lyndon Johnson, there is another thing that has to be thought about when talking about this whole entire thing. And that is the fact, and Robert Caro in Master of the Senate really does a good job explaining this, which is that the Southerners stayed with the Democratic Party because it gave them, as far as members of Congress, it gave them strength. It made them kingmakers because they were both conservative and Democrats. Okay, so neither the Republicans on their own, in most cases, there were some cases like in the 50s, most of the time the Democrats were in charge. They're only in charge because of the Southern Democrats giving them their votes. So if there was a vote for something that was kind of iffy, the conservative Democrats could bolt over to the Republicans and say, we're going to vote with the Republicans, thus the Democrats and the leadership losing, or they could stay with the Democrats. And if you go look at the 1940s, 50s, 60s, I mean, there are some exceptions. Look at how many people in the leadership of the Democratic Party, speakers of the House, majority leaders of the Senate, look where they're from. And you could probably even look at the 30s and 20s and all that. The reason why Southerners were Democrats was because that would make them kingmakers. Okay, if they were Republicans, they would have just been any other conservative Republican. But they had the ability to swing back and forth, which they usually didn't swing over to the Republicans, but they usually pressured the Democratic Party to maybe not go so far. Robert Caro in Master of the Senate does a great job talking about that.
They teamed up with states' rights Republicans to attempt to block civil rights legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1960, and the more famous Civil Rights Act of 1964. So now the next time you're at a party, you can brag about how you know about the other civil rights acts that passed just a few years before the more famous 1964 one. That'll certainly make you look really cool. Anyway, the most famous example of Southern states' rights Democrats teaming up with a Republican is them teaming up to support
Barry
Barry
Goldwater.
Goldwater when he famously got his butt kicked in the presidential election of 1964. Now, Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but not because he was racist.
Right.
In fact, he was a member of the NAACP and very active in desegregation efforts.
Yep.
And this is important to point out because, again, it's complicated. It's very complicated. You know, on one hand, you could look at that and argue, well, racist or not, he opposed something that was beneficial to African Americans, which is true. But sometimes people oppose things that are good things on principle. And I have a lot of, respect for them for that. or they support things on principle, even if they might not agree with them.
Yeah.
I don't dive into modern politics very often, but we just had the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, our first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. And all indications, at least on the surface, are to me that she's very qualified for the position. Now, there are the vast majority anymore, and I think it's going to be this way for a while, when you have a Republican nominate somebody to the Supreme Court, the Democrats are going to oppose that person and vice versa, regardless of the qualifications.
And it never used to be that way.
Be that way. Even 20, 30 years ago,
Right.
the vast majority of Supreme Court nominees got overwhelmingly approved. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, probably one of the most liberal members of the Supreme Court in the last generation, was overwhelmingly approved by Republicans, even conservatives, because they understood that while they might disagree on policy, they understood that constitutionally the president has the right to appoint somebody to that position as long as they're qualified.
She might have been one of the last ones.
And so Barry Goldwater is a guy who supports civil rights, but opposed on principle the federal government's involvement in law on that level. You can agree or disagree with him on that, but don't label him racist because he opposed something that would help African Americans. Again, more complicated than that.
He even supported the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 and the 24th Amendment, which eliminated the poll tax. He just thought one of the provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was unconstitutional and gave the federal government too much power.
So, but again, that has been used to say, look at the shift towards racism and against black people by the Republican Party because Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
No, no. He might have opposed it for for the reasons that, aren't racist. But in the South, a lot of people oppose it just because it was a Civil Rights Act. It's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I would say here.
And on the surface, you can convince a lot of people that's the case who don't take the time to really study all this.
That's all. Wait a second. Are you not watching this video? You're just listening to it? Put those dishes down and watch. There's some pretty cool visuals. Like my face. So even though the Democrat Lyndon Johnson, or LBJ, kicked Barry Goldwater's butt in the 1964 presidential election, he was worried that his endorsement of civil rights legislation might lose him more and more supporters in the South. And he was right. When Republican Richard Nixon decided to run for president again in 1968, he hoped to somehow snatch up many of those upset voters. Well, he didn't get many because, remember, the segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever dude, George Wallace, snatched up a lot of those votes with his third-party run.
And just like the Southern strategy, which he's about to talk about here, there are, right now, for example, you've got a lot of people kind of competing for the Trump voters, so to speak, right? Whether or not Trump runs again, if he doesn't, let's say he doesn't, you're going to have people competing for those voters, the people who felt a certain way. Same thing with Reagan. You had a lot of Democrats who voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976 who vote for Reagan in 1980 because you appeal to that electorate on a particular issue. And so the Southern strategy is just one of many examples of people appealing to certain voters on a particular issue to win those voters to their side.
The term Southern strategy is often connected to this dude, Kevin Phillips, who didn't come up with it, but he certainly popularized the heck out of it. In 1970, the New York Times published an interview of him in which he stated, quote, "From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old, comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats."
Okay, now before Chris says something, I'm going to say something, which is that, right, that's correct. And to me, this is not a strategy. It's just a reading of the tea leaves of the process that's going on in the South. And this is my whole entire point. I don't think the Southern strategy is a strategy. I think that it's just the natural progression of what eventually happened. And what we see here is we just see an examination of, hey, I'm looking at the votes. This is happening. If this happens, it's going to be this way. It's just kind of reading the tea leaves.
Phillips wasn't necessarily trying to get Southern Democrats to switch to Republican. He was just trying to get them to vote Republican. But it would be a slow process.
Yes.
The Republican Party really started to convert those Southern Democrats in the 1970 midterm elections.
And this is, okay, so this is really interesting. The 1970 election there is Howard Baker. Howard Baker, Congressman from Howard Baker Jr., congressman from the 1st Congressional District, who would eventually go on and run for president. He did not sign the Southern Manifesto. Well, his father did not sign the Southern Manifesto, but he was a supporter of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, right? So this election of Howard Baker in Tennessee in 1970 kind of, it negates, it really negates the argument, I think. Now, the Virginia one doesn't, because that was Harry Byrd Jr. Harry Byrd Sr. had kicked the bucket. Harry Byrd Jr. took over his seat, and he actually left the Democratic Party, basically saying, if the Democratic Party is going to support black candidates, I'm not going to be a member of the Democratic Party, so therefore I'm going to run as an independent. He did, and he ended up winning. One thing that he does not show on here, and it really wouldn't show it, but I think it is important, 1970 is a huge election for moderate to liberal Democrats winning gubernatorial elections. Okay, you have John West in South Carolina. You have Reuben Askew in Florida. You have Dale Bumpers in Arkansas. But interestingly, Jimmy Carter wins in 70, but he basically wins as kind of the racist candidate. Now, once he gets inaugurated, in his inauguration address, he basically said, hey, screw you segregationists and racists. I mean, he basically says that. But he teamed up with George Wallace and Lester Maddox, who was running for lieutenant governor. He won against Carl Sanders, the former governor of Georgia, who was probably, I would say, up to that time, probably one of the most liberal people to have run statewide in the South, you know, along with Ralph Yarborough in Texas and Claude Pepper when he was the senator in Florida back in the day. So I think even though he shows the 70 election, and sorry, I got something in my eye here. Even though he's showing the 70 election, to me, this is kind of the election that shows that not only are the Republicans bringing in moderate people like Howard Baker, but at some of these congressional levels, but at the gubernatorial level, we're starting to see more liberal or at least more moderate Democrats winning. To me, this, like, 1970 is a counter argument to the Southern strategy. And I make this argument with the Electoral College map saying, oh, you see a red state here, therefore it must have been because of race, therefore it was conservative, and that's it. No, this Howard Baker's election was the total opposite.
70 midterm elections by making states' rights part of their platform. Yeah, it was mostly about targeting pro-integration and pro-civil rights Southern Democrats. They depicted Al Gore, no, not that one.
I was going to
his
say,
dad,
it was his father.
Albert Gore Sr., as a radical leftist and attacked Gore's support of integration and civil rights. It worked, and Gore lost to the Republican Congressman Bill Brock. Still, though,
it's funny, I use both of those pictures in my upcoming video. Anyway, but Brock was more moderate. Gore was a moderate. He signed the Southern Manifesto. He He was moderate on the issue of race, but if we really want to talk about why Gore won or lost in 70, they really got him on being against Vietnam. Okay, and this kind of goes back to that fighting against communism thing, which now brings it outside of the realm of a racial dog whistle, right? I think it really was a racial dog whistle back in the day, back in the 1950s and early 1960s. But once we're in the Vietnam War, the South was very pro-Vietnam War. And if you went against the Vietnam War, you were more than likely going to lose. Okay, as a matter of fact, of the most pro-war candidates that ran in 1968, it was George Wallace. That's why he had Curtis LeMay as his vice presidential running mate, who basically said, yeah, I want to bomb, I want to nuke Vietnam. Like in their first press conference, when he introduced him, he's like, yeah, I want to nuke Vietnam. And then Wallace like, okay, fine. Have a nice day. We're done with the press conference. And they basically never used LeMay again. Read Dan Carter's book, Politics of Rage. It really gets into that. It's very, very interesting. But yeah.
Overall, the Republican Party continues to struggle to find votes in the South. It's almost like people fear change and are tribalistic.
Yep.
Even so, Nixon was amazingly able to win all of the American South in his butt-kicking of Democrat George McGovern in the election of 1972. Things were looking up for Republicans in the South. That is, until the Watergate scandal, which devastated the party nearly everywhere in the country, not just the South. Plus, in 1976, remember, the Democrats ran a Southern boy, Jimmy Carter, so he did pretty well in the South, despite being a supporter of integration and civil rights. Besides, he called for an end to busing as a means to control racial segregation, and he purposely limited his campaign appearances before African American groups. But there's another piece of the puzzle I ought to mention about 1976. You see, this was the first presidential election after the landmark Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade.
So again, this is why it's important to note that there's no moment when things change. New issues crop up and those lead to evolution in the parties. Okay, so before Roe v. Wade, abortion is not a nationally debated issue, but ever since it's going to become one. You know, before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, while segregation had been something that had been dealt with, it didn't become a national issue. These things happen and they become issues. Same thing is true today. Obviously, we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, and that's going to be a major issue in this next election. It's going to be a major issue in the midterm elections this fall here in America, is how we deal with that. All of these things cause constant evolution in the parties.
But to build on that, because from the evidence that I've seen, Roe v. Wade didn't really have an impact post Roe v. Wade in the South or really anywhere. Okay, as a matter of fact, the American National Election Studies don't even really ask questions about abortion, even after Roe v. Wade. And we don't see much change in the South as far as who's voting for whom. So therefore, it's kind of not necessarily as important during this little, 1973 to, let's say, late 70s, early 80s. So when does it become important? If we're going to talk about the whole party change and the Republicans becoming the conservative party, or more accurately say Southern conservatives flocked to the Republican Party, to me, the most important person in this whole entire discussion is Jerry Falwell. Okay? Because he was able to take issues of abortion, prayer in school. Now, prayer in school was a big one here too. So like Everett Dirksen introduced a constitutional amendment to introduce prayer in school, or voluntary prayer in school, not like institute that you needed to do it, but voluntary prayer. That became a big issue in the South. That was a bigger issue in the South than abortion was between 1973 and 1980. But what Jerry Falwell did is he brought all those things together, as well as worked with business leaders to add the capitalistic aspect to it, to also be anti-communist. They were also able to bring personal freedoms and liberties, which means what? Second Amendment. You should be able to own a gun. Jerry Falwell, to me, is one of the most consequential political figures in late 20th century history. If we want to talk about somebody who changed a party, he's somebody who changed a party. At this time, 76, abortion wasn't really the issue that we know it today.
Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected a pregnant woman's liberty to have an abortion. Watch my video about it if you haven't already. Wait, some of you haven't watched it yet? Anyway, afterward, the Republican Party was more effective than the Democratic Party at winning over socially conservative Christians.
So this is where you start to have the Christian conservative movement being associated heavily with the Republicans, where you start to have these social issues, and now again, you've still got polarization within each party, right. Because, for example, I can remember, they don't really exist anymore, but they're even maybe 20 years ago, there was a thing called Blue Dog Democrats, which were more conservative Democrats who tended to get elected in southern states, who might be more progressive on fiscal issues, like in terms of taxes and things like that.
Funny story, I actually started an organization called the Young Blue Dog Coalition. I was a conservative Democrat at that point, and I met Gene Taylor, Charlie Stenholm, Congressman Brewer from Oklahoma, John Tanner from Tennessee, Bill Orton, he was from Utah, Sanford Bishop I met, Glenn Browder from Alabama. So I met all these guys. I flew down there, and interestingly, as I was flying up, I guess I should say up there because I was flying from Florida, I had worked in the office of Bob Graham. I never really met Bob Graham while I was there. Anyway, on the flight there, Bob Graham's on the flight with me. And I go back to the bathroom. I'm like, is that Bob Graham? Then I come back and I look and I go, Senator Bob Graham. And he's like, yeah. I go, I used to work in your Tampa office. Like, oh, really? Yeah, I know, blah, 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 blah. Like, we were talking. He's like, hey, do you have a ride into town? Because we're both flying to Washington, D.C., so I could go to this meeting. I go, no. He's like, oh, well, when you get there, just stick with me, and my aide, who's already picking me up, will bring you into town. I'm like, okay, cool. So Bob Graham and his aide drove me into DC. They go, do you have a hotel? I go, no. You got to realize this was before booking or anything, right? And so he hooked me up with a hotel there. Expensive hotel, but he hooked me up with one nonetheless. And then the next few days, I met members of Congress. Bud Kramer, another one. Bud Kramer, that was a funny story too, because Bud Kramer, I met him earlier that day. And then as it was like late in the afternoon or early evening, like 5 o'clock, as I was walking across the street, Bud Kramer was driving, and I guess he didn't notice that I had the crosswalk and the light was that like red for him. But I'm just walking, all of a sudden I hear slamming on the brakes, and I look, and you see the Alabama license plate, and it's Bud Kramer. And I just start laughing, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm like, forget about it. But it was just so funny because I met him earlier that day. So yeah, I was extremely involved with that. But I would say I'm the opposite of most people. They say as most people get older, they become more conservative. No, as I've become older, I have gone far to the left.
That, but on more conservative on issues like abortion, they could be pro-life, but still Democrats, and you would have more liberal Republicans who would be more pro-choice Republicans, but more conservative on fiscal issues who identified more with the Republican Party. It's only been more recently that you've seen more polarization, where most of the Republicans are socially conservative and fiscally conservative, and most of the Democrats tend to be more progressive or liberal on social issues and fiscal issues. It didn't used.
And I would make the argument that if we're talking about the totality of it, I would say that it took longer for the Republicans to become completely pro-life than it did for the Democrats to become completely pro-choice. I'd have to look at the data on that. That's just kind of a gut feeling I got.
To be quite that polarized.
Mostly on the issue of abortion. And in case you didn't know, the American South has historically had a lot of socially conservative Christians. Before 1976, there is evidence that most Republicans were actually pro-choice in the abortion debate. But that year, many Republican candidates declared themselves to be pro-life. Not only that, but many Democrats who got elected in 1976 across the country also consider themselves to be pro-life. Like Jimmy Carter and Al Gore.
Yep.
Yes, that's Al Gore, Albert Gore Sr.'s son. He first got elected to Congress that year in a southern state as a Democrat, personally being pro-choice, but speaking out against federal funding for abortion, and generally came across as pro-life. Flash forward to the 1980s, and now more and more Republicans are pro-life, and more Democrats are pro-choice. And of course, Republicans often made it a states' rights issue. Basically, it should be a state's right to determine whether or not they can ban abortion.
He keeps harping on that issue of states' rights because really, that's the difference. The South, as I mentioned earlier, has always been historically pro-states' rights and anti-strong federal government, going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. And that's still true today. The thing that changed was the party of states' rights. More of the states' rights people are now on the Republican side than the Democratic side. That's what shifted. And it shifted over a lot of these issues.
And perhaps this is overblown a bit, but I have to mention the Republican strategist Lee Atwater, who admitted that the Southern strategy had kept on going throughout the late 1970s. And sadly, most historians say much of it relied on racist dog whistles. Oh, I'm not saying that dog whistles are literally racist. This is a political term. In politics, the term dog whistle refers to coded or suggestive language meant to increase support for something that most folks think is bad.
And the problem here is, again, this is one of those terms that people use to demonize issues they disagree with. Am I denying that such a thing exists? No, of course not. It absolutely does happen. But it has become one of those catchphrases that people like to throw at anything that they disagree with in order to make the people saying that thing they disagree with out to be evil or pro whatever issue. So for example, if you're a pro states' rights person, well, that's a dog whistle for racism. Are there people who are pro states' rights who are also racist? Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
But does that mean that anybody who believes strongly in states' rights is a racist? No, of course not. So I get nervous when that gets brought up because I know how that term has been abused. But it is true.
It's sneaky. The idea is that you say stuff that seems harmless, but really implies harmful stuff once you dig deeper. In the case of the Republican Party, most historians say the party shifted their rhetoric to use dog whistles to appeal to racist Southern voters. Don't believe me? In 1981, Lee Atwater said the quiet part out loud. Are we really doing this too? This video is definitely going to be age restricted.
Yeah, no kidding.
Let's roll censored clip of that infamous quote by him.
Yeah, now y'all want to quote me now.
Don't worry, we won't quote you. We will.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts your backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
Now, here's the problem. That quote's awful. It absolutely is.
Right.
No denying that.
Try to defend
But you could pull similar quotes from people like LBJ saying similar kinds of things. So again, this is more of a Southern
True.
conservative,
Yes.
Southern racist segregationist conservative than a description of the modern Republican Party.
The difference between, and I mentioned this in my other channel about the Cronkite quote, you know, even like the quote saying when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 64, saying, you know, I'm signing this, I'm signing away the South for a generation. That quote comes from Bill Moyers, and he even says it's not as extreme as it had become what it was, right? The difference is that this is on tape. Even though he said don't quote me, this is on tape. A lot of what we have as far as what Johnson said is second and third hand accounts. Like what Johnson's saying, and I did my whole video on the other channel. It was like if I lost Cronkite, I lost Middle America or something to that effect. That was apparently, it went from Johnson to an aide, from an aide to an Air Force One pilot, to an Air Force One pilot, to like a reporter, right? And it wasn't even reported until like 10 years later, or maybe even 20 years later. Okay. So yeah, a lot of what Johnson said is mostly hearsay. This isn't hearsay. This is Lee Atwater literally saying the quiet part out loud.
For example, or likewise that the things that Johnson said and believed about how we're going to get those N-word people voting Democrat for the next 200 years automatically means that all Democrats today support that kind of thing, which is also nonsense.
I agree.
Oof, that was something. Now, whether he realized it or not, historians say Ronald Reagan even often used this coded language throughout his presidency. Heck, many Democrats also did. Regardless, by the 1990s, most of the old conservative Southern Democrats from the olden days had literally died off. And the younger Southerners no longer had that attachment to the Democratic Party. Overall, the Southern voter really didn't change that much.
True.
The two major political parties did.
Yes.
Even if it was a slow process. From the 1940s all the way up to the 1990s, many southern states were swing states, but ever since, they have been reliably Republican.
And yet you see, Florida, for example, has gone back and forth a little bit. Georgia just went for the Democrat, went for
Virginia.
Joe Biden in the last election.
North Carolina.
You know, there are some states like that will go back and forth. Arkansas has gone back and forth a few times. Virginia has become much more reliably blue as of late, but is now seeming to shift a little bit back toward the Republicans. You know, Ohio had been a swing state, but seems to be getting more Republican as of late. So those shifts are constant, and they're going to continue. Yep. Like I said, they're not going to look like they did 20 years from now, how they do today.
And it all started with racist Southerners.
See, this is what I was talking about because I knew this picture. Race mixing is communism. See, that's the dog whistle I was talking about.
Really scared of integration and African Americans having more rights. So does that mean the Republican Party today, especially in the American South, is racist?
No.
I don't think it is.
So as the South became less racist, it became more Republican.
Well, that's one way to put it. Yeah, let's briefly look at the dude who said that in that clip. That's Dinesh D'Souza, a popular Republican pundit who has spent much of his career saying that the party switch and even the Southern strategy was a myth.
And again, this goes back to what I said earlier. It's a reaction to unfair accusations by responding with inaccurate information.
Yep.
It's wrong on both sides.
Yep.
It's wrong for people to take what a party did 40 years ago and apply it to those people today, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. And Republicans do this too. Republicans say the Democrat Party is the party of slavery. No, it's not. The Democrat Party 150 years ago was the party of slavery. It's not that party anymore. The Republican Party that had the Southern strategy to reach out to segregationist Southern whites does not mean that the Republican Party of today is inherently racist. There are racists, there are horrible people on both sides. There are great people on both sides. we get these knee-jerk reactions, and it causes people to respond to misinformation by misinformation of their own, and both sides are wrong.
The big switch is a big lie. The Democrats didn't switch from being the bad guys to the good guys. They simply found a new and bigger scam.
The left's doctrine of the big switch, the idea that the two parties switched sides, on the face of it is a little bit strange. It's sort of like if someone were to say to you, you know, there was this date in the 1960s when the cops all became robbers and the robbers all became cops. You'd be like, really? How?
Yeah, but there's like no proof of that. Okay. We can look at an electoral map and see what the hell happened, right?
Could that happen? It makes no sense. It turned out that non-racist conservatives in the South began to move over into the Republican Party. The simple truth is, as the South
And again, he's not right, because there were plenty of racist conservatives who switched to the Republicans too. It's being really disingenuous, and then that causes a knee-jerk from the other side. Well, see, he's wrong. He's lying. They always lie. Then because he's lying, it must be true. No, it's complicated and nuanced. That's what it is.
became less racist, it became more Republican. I'm going to make a few more videos on the big switch because this is...
But then again, this goes back to what I was saying before, is Dinesh D'Souza will always use Democrat and Republican. He will never use liberal and conservative, or at least he won't use conservative. He keeps it within the context of partisanship, because as long as he's thinking, okay, people are going to think Democrats liberal, Republicans conservative. They're already thinking that. So therefore, if I only stick to party ideology, or excuse me, partisan ideology or partisanship, then I'm going to be able to pull the wool over people's eyes. Okay. Yeah, this is the reason you never hear him say conservative in these things.
Become absolutely central to the narrative of the Democratic left. This is the insidiousness of what the left is trying to do here with this doctrine of the switch. And the switch, of course, is a total lie.
He has been extremely influential with this rhetoric. In fact, many other Republican Party pundits have also made similar claims.
And that's partially because I think Democrats have been extremely successful in the rhetoric of saying that there has been this strict switch, and that means that all Republicans are racist.
Yes.
I'm not going to say it again. It's more complicated than that.
And the myth of things like the Southern switch and the
I will say this. These are not the people that the Republican Party needs representing it. I would say the same thing about certain Democrats. The unfortunate reality in our world today, especially with social media, is that the loudest voices tend to be the most extreme.
Yeah.
Candace Owens and the Matt Walshes and the Ben Shapiros of the world do not represent all conservatives anymore.
No, but they represent a lot of conservatives.
Crazy loud voices on the left represent all Democrats. Most of us are much more reasonable than that.
And I'd like to know, when he says crazy voices on the left, I'd like to know who he's talking about. Like, are you talking about AOC? Because to me, there's a difference between peddling conspiracy theories and wanting everybody to have health care. There's a big difference in rhetoric there. But yeah, I don't know who he's talking about. I wish he would say. That would be interesting.
And unfortunately, we tend to take the loudest, most extreme voices, and then we apply their politics and their voice to all other people on their side of the political spectrum. That's really unfair to do that, regardless of what side you're on.
Southern strategy, which never happened.
This story of the two parties switching identities is a myth.
This is something that you're told quite a bit, okay? And this is something that is one of the most pervasive myths that the left has used. And they've used it successfully because it's just sort of gone unchallenged.
And I hope that, I don't know where he's going to go with the rest of this video, but I really hope that Matt takes the time to look at some of the voices on the left then who are saying the same kind of extreme things about Republicans all being racist because of the Southern strategy today. I don't know if he will.
We are going to debunk the party switch / Southern strategy, why the parties never switched in 1964, like all the Democrat historians like to claim.
Most of them just attack a straw man like this gentleman does in this video, or they cherry pick or oversimplify history to back up their claims.
An average of 20 to 30 something points Republicans supporting the Civil Rights Act back then.
Show me 100, show me 200.
That back then thing is kind of important if you're going to put it in today's context.
In that period of time, there were Democrats that became Republicans that did not change their philosophy. Now, I've been with a lot of Democrats who switched to the Republican Party. One of the guys told me, he said, I've been in the Democrat Party my whole life. We've never said the Pledge of Allegiance. I've been a Republican meeting. I thought we should be saying that. And you guys opened with a prayer. I want to be a Republican. It was not about race. It was about different values.
But there's one thing these claims seem to have in common. They are all fueled by an agenda. An agenda to make the modern Republican Party simply look better. But I will gladly point out when both the Republican Party and Democratic Party suck. In fact, they both suck all the time.
Amen. Amen.
Then again, often Democrats bring up the party switch today to make the modern Republican Party look bad.
Good. I'm glad he's doing
this. Who was the one who came up with the Southern strategy? That was the Republican Party.
Here comes Shapiro. Facts don't care about your feelings.
The reason that the Republican Party started to win in the South, it began in the 1950s, not after the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it was largely due to the movement of industry down south. It was new fringe members of the Republican Party, younger members of the Republican Party, who switched over to the Republican Party in the South, not old Democrats, who remained old Democrats and are still old Democrats.
And see, again, here's the problem.
And honestly, and I might have to see what Shapiro has to say. And I mentioned this earlier, you had a lot of people from the North come from the South, or come to the South. That is a part of this narrative that's almost never told. And it seems like that's what Shapiro's saying here. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and end it there. I got the video linked down below. I have both Matt's and Chris's videos linked down below, so you can go ahead and check those out. Overall, I think that Chris kind of advocates what my research is showing, which is that it's not black and white. None of these things that we're seeing are black and white. And I gave you a bunch of examples during this video that really makes that case. So with Chris, bravo on it, saying that there's a nuance to it. Now, do I think either of them know the intricacies of it? I've been studying this for plus 30 years, right? I've delved into Southern politics. So they might not know the intricacies of congressional, gubernatorial, Senate elections and all that, or using the ANES data to try to glean from that how people were voting. That's fine. But the reality is that it really is a nuanced argument. That is what Matt is saying, and that is what Chris is saying. And kudos to both of them for saying that. All right, well, that's it for today's video. I will see you in the next one. Go to my Discord. Tell me if there's anything you want to see. If there's another video you want me to react to, put it down in the description down below. Please kind of keep it to history. I've been getting people saying, hey, react to this modern political thing. Now, I want it to be connected to history, okay? All right, so thank you all very much. I'll see you all later. Bye for now.